All right, well, hi everyone. This will be the first part in a series of the Gait unit. And what we're going to do, we're going to start off by talking about a lot of the basic terminology associated with normal gait patterns. And then we'll transition into the in-person sessions to focus on more practice with this and also a little bit more about the deviations and the abnormal gait patterns. But first, let's just talk about what gait is and what are the normal cycles and phases as it relates to the gait pattern. So there are two really types of definitions. There's this physiological definition to show, what happens to the bones, the muscles, the nervous system, and how are these all integrated together. And if there's a deficit in here, how can that lead to some type of abnormal or pathological gait? And then there's the more mechanical or biomechanical definition associated with locomotion, these alternating movements, propulsion. So these types of kinematic terminologies are more the mechanical definition, but essentially gait is this alternating movement of our lower extremities to support our mass in terms of our trunk, extremities, and head to move ourselves from point A to point B. So just a quick summary in terms of terminology there. Obviously, we use this to maintain upright posture, produce movement of the body as a whole. It is a translatory progression, so it's like we're gliding almost along the surface as we walk. So that's just your basic introduction. Let's show you just a little bit of a video. The point of this video is to show you how many different types of variations.
Look at the monkey, funny monkey, little red monkey acting.
What will we do with a drunken sailor? What will we do?
So we don't have to do the whole 100, but you can see, I mean, there's 100 all very similar and alternating. So there you go. So here's just some summary information. I'll skim through this, read through this material. Let me know if you have questions. Some terminologies that fit into this pretty well would be equilibrium. This is your ability to maintain that upright posture and balance. So when you hear equilibrium, you're probably thinking about balance, because that's really describing a similar concept. When you're thinking about locomotion and all that videos that you just saw there, it shows different variations of locomotion. It's that rhythmic, alternating, stepping pattern is that locomotion. And certainly you need musculoskeletal integrity for that, and you need neurological control. Our CNS is going to receive information from our PNS, and it's going to send information to the PNS to create change with our balance, our muscle activation, and so forth. So it's both a feed forward and a feedback mechanism in place for us to stay balanced. In terms of the cycle, this is probably the first important thing that'll be a good thing to highlight or put an asterisk next to in the PowerPoint, differentiating between the two main phases. There's the stance phase. So this is your closed kinematic chain phase where there's weight bearing involved, where the distal extremity is in contact with the ground or the carpet or the step or whatever you're in contact with. That's stance phase. And then there's the swing phase, and that's where it's your open kinematic chain, where your distal extremity is not in contact. Now you can imagine with a gait cycle, there's the stance phase and swing phase for each lower extremity. So while the right foot or lower extremity is in swing phase, the left will be in stance phase, and vice versa for a portion of that time. And that's why there's this overlap. It's not 50-50. So you can imagine that if you're walking, a portion of the time, both feet will be in contact with the ground. And that represents 60% of the time. And then 40% of the time, one extremity will be off the ground or open kinematic chain. And certainly these numbers are going to vary depending on an individual's walking in terms of the time may vary. But these phases are representing the different events. And we're going to divide these events up into terminologies. But the 60-40% ratio is going to be important to know between stance phase and swing phase. But we'll divide this up a little bit further. Even just with the little stick drawing here, you can see double stance or double support versus this one, single support. So this left foot is in stance phase, the right foot is in swing phase. And the right foot is in stance phase and the left is in swing phase. So we'll go over this and these periods and describe this in much more detail, but that's a high level picture of it. This is a great slide to know. It divides it up into your 60% stance phase and your 40% swing phase. What you see on the slide is important to mention. There's one lower extremity. You may think, oh, she's wearing a very high sock. No, that's just representing the leg that we call the reference limb. The reference limb is what we're focusing on for stance phase or swing phase. Because if you look at this first image, you're saying, well, yeah, both are in stance phase. But as this one's coming off, as the left foot is coming off, so between here and here, the left foot is in swing phase, but we're in stance phase. So we're just talking about only the reference limb. And in this case, the reference limb is going to be the right lower extremity. So this gait cycle is related to the reference limb. 60% stance phase, 40% swing phase. But now we have to add a little bit of more detail to that. So let's talk about two terminologies associated with this. Very important slide to summarize all of this. There's what's known as traditional terminology, and here are the different words associated with this. Heel strike, which you're still going to hear, foot flat, mid stance, heel off, toe off. Those are all phrases that are appropriate to use and to document with a patient's gait observation and analysis. However, a lot of people choose to use the Ranchos Los Amigos system. And just for some history, Ranchos Los Amigos was really one of the pioneers within the physical therapy movement. They started at the very beginning. This is a hospital outside of Los Angeles, south of Los Angeles, near Linwood, California. And it started with the 1800s. But physical therapy, we know, didn't start till the 1920s. So they were one of the first major institutions to institute a physical therapy program. And they've been a really well-known source. They're still in existence and have a really well background with gait, but also with neurological rehab. They focus on neuro rehab in that facility. And so they had this terminology which they used, and this really became accepted, especially in the United States. So these terms are great to know, and a lot of the textbooks will use these as the standard terminologies. So this is the Ranchos Los Amigos. We often abbreviate this RLA. So this is the RLA terminology, and it makes sense to think about it with what it's doing. So the reference limb, there's initial contact. So whenever the right foot hits the ground, there's a loading response. So this is weight, the mass, going through the entire lower extremity. It's absorbing that force. There's mid stance, and that turns out to be the same in both systems, so that's consistent. Ranchos Los Amigos, I guess, couldn't think of something better than mid stance, so that makes sense. Mid stance, that's right in the middle of the stance phase. And then you have your terminal stance. And so this is at the point where the heel is coming off the ground and weight is going through the metatarsals and the toes. That's your terminal stance. And then there's the part where the toes come off the ground. We call this, or Ranchos Los Amigos calls this, the pre-swing phase. So look at this slide a few different times. You should know both the traditional terminology and the RLA terminology. They're really good to describe the different phases. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about the stance phase based on the RLA terminology. So here's just your summary, and we're going to break these down one per slide coming up right here. So that initial contact, also known as heel strike, is the beginning of the gait cycle for the reference limb, and so you could see it there. It is the instant that the foot strikes the ground. The reason why some people changed it from heel strike is if there were some pathology, the foot heel may not be the first thing to strike the ground. So initial contact makes a little more sense. If they had some type of contracture or deficit and they're in a plantar flex position, maybe they've had a heel fracture, so you've probably seen someone walk on their toes. Whatever part of the foot hits the ground, that's going to be determined as initial contact. We know that the majority of the time it is heel strike, but certainly other parts of the foot could strike the ground first. And this is known as double limb support. So you can see both feet are in contact with the ground. So this is your double limb support. The next phase would be loading response, also known as foot flat. So this is the instance during stance when the foot is flat on the ground. So the foot comes in full contact with the floor and the body weight or the mass is fully transferred onto the stance limb, onto the reference limb. Certainly you're going to have still some mass going through the alternate limb, but the majority of the mass is going to be distributed through the reference limb during this. So there's a large impact of load passing through the reference limb during this phase. And shock absorption is consequently important to accept this weight. The next one is mid stance, and we said this is the same for both. Mid stance for RLA or traditional terminology. So this is your 20% point through the gait cycle. This is maintaining the body's forward progression that requires stabilization of the upper body as it passes over the relatively small base of support. So you can see during this phase, we have a small base of support. As compared to the last phase, we have a larger base of support. So you can see during this phase, our balance is somewhat more compromised. But we'll talk about when it's even more compromised. But you still have you still have this limb that's about to come off. So there's still some assistance from the other limb. But primarily that reference limb is supporting the body. Okay, so now you have that terminal stance or heel off. So at this point, the opposite extremity, in this case the left lower extremity, is going through its swing phase. So for terminal stance, there's only that single limb support. So only the reference limb is supporting the lower extremity. So balance would be compromised during this. Large propulsive force is associated with this because now you're transitioning your mass from your right lower extremity to your left lower extremity, which is about to absorb that weight. So at this point, you're finishing up and you have this pre-swing, also more of a push-off or toe-off phase. At this point, you are back to double limb support. So this phase begins when the contralateral extremity or limb makes contact with the floor, and it ends when the toes of the reference limb leave the floor. So you could see that there's some vertical force as well with this. It's not just going to be the translatory force. So those are the individual phases. What you may like to see is this representation because it's sometimes confusing to think about. Those are just landmarks or reference points within the phases. There are movements that occur besides just those snapshots of where those exist. So between initial contact and loading response, there's obviously a change in movement or body position here. During this one, you can see from mid stance to terminal stance, there is that swing phase of the contralateral lower extremity and then pre-swing here. So this is all during stance phase of the reference limb. Okay, so let's stop there, and on the next video we'll get into the swing phase.